Wired for Autism presents From an Autistic Point of View, a series of short presentations looking at what it means to be autistic, presented by an independent speaker trainer, autism needs assessor, blogger and postgraduate student. Today I will be discussing autism through the mists of time. The term autism, from the Greek word for self, was first used by psychiatrist Eugen Bleuler in 1911, and then gained more prominence through the works of Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger during the 1940s, although Grunya Sukareva characterised autism 2 decades earlier. However, autism had been well documented before this through early myths and stories of changelings. There were folk tales of fairies stealing human babies, substituting them for changelings who looked like the original babies but lacked their essential essence, and later grew on to develop behaviours and characteristics that were outside of what society regarded as the norm. Many researchers and historians have identified other stories which seem to chart autism through the myths of history. Some modern historians and biblical scholars even theorise that Old Testament characters such as Samson, Solomon and Joseph, yes, him of the Technicolor Dreamcoat fame, may have possessed autistic traits. A more frequently mentioned possible autistic is the New Testament Jewish leader Nicodemus, as the Gospel of John portrays him as a literal thinker, keen on rules, who couldn't understand facial expressions without a lot of explanation, and who appeared to prefer meeting in low-sensory, quiet environments. Better documented accounts in histories include that of Brother Juniper, a disciple of St. Francis of Assisi. Like many saintly figures in history, Brother Juniper often sought solitude and appeared to struggle greatly with behavioural difficulties, either inherently or through societal expectations upon him. He was literal in his obedience, showed stereotypical behaviour, and possibly suffered from seizures. One documented example of his literal thinking is shown here. Once, while visiting the sick friar, Juniper asked him if he could be of any service. The friar asked for some pig's feet to eat, as it would give him great consolation. Brother Juniper, feeling compelled to help the sick friar, took a knife from the kitchen, went into the forest, and found a group of pigs feeding. Juniper caught one of the pigs, swiftly cut a leg off, and ran back to the kitchen to prepare it, leaving the rest of the pig in the forest. Unknown to Juniper, the man in charge of the pigs was standing there watching it all happen, and quickly informed his master of the situation. Another, and much more well-known account from history is that of Victor, the wild boy of Avignon. He was a French feral child discovered in the woods near Saint-Sonin-sur-Rance. He was brought to a nearby town to be cared for by a widow. He ran away and fled back to the woods. In January 1800, Victor emerged from the woods on his own. His lack of speech, appearance, food preferences and scarred body were suggestive of several years living alone in the wild. He was described as walking on 4 legs, eating plants, and being hairy, deaf and mute. After being examined by several professionals, he went under the care of a young physician, Jean-Marc Gaspard Itard, who worked with him for 5 years and gave the boy the name Victor. Despite making some progress over the years, Itard could not get Victor to speak. He wondered why Victor would choose to remain silent when he had already proved that he was not, in fact, deaf. Victor also did not understand tones of voice. He showed characteristic signs of repeated and restrictive patterns of behaviour, like grinding of his teeth, incessant rocking back and forth, and sudden spasmodic movements. Collectively, these characteristics have led to Professor Jutta Frith and others to argue that Victor may have been autistic. Certainly, like many children later diagnosed with classic autism, he was non-verbal, responded to structure, and was resistant to social training. Since Victor's time, several historical figures have been retrospectively labelled as being autistic. These include Einstein, who was described as a loner who repeated the same sentences compulsively until he was 7, and other figures include Sir Isaac Newton, Leonardo da Vinci, and Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. All appear to present classical autistic traits such as restrictive special interests, difficulties in social relationships, and problems with social communication. While some may question the accuracy or validity of these retrospective labels, many autistics, including Temple Grandin, argue that for major innovators in science, engineering and art, autism is an essential factor for human progress in these fields. Like many autistic, I'm often asked where my autism comes from. In studying my family tree, I find generations of engineers and before them blacksmiths on my father's side. However, I like to trace my autistic DNA to my 9th great-grandfather, Henry Bonjour Crisp, 1581 to 1663. He was a firm parliamentarian and had supported Oliver Cromwell during the English Civil War. He was also a very wealthy man, and in order to raise funds for King Charles II, who was in exile, a plot was conceived to kidnap Sir Henry, take him to France and ransom him for the sum of £3,000, an enormous amount of money in those days. So, on a dark night in August 1657, Henry was sitting in his large hall, conversing with his servants, when suddenly the confused sound of voices and shuffling of many feet were heard in the distance, and what was described at the time, a troop of wild-looking sailors stood before the trembling old gentleman, and he was smuggled onto a ship bound for France. After 8 months, the ransom was paid, and Henry was returned home to Thanet, Kent, in England. The only French the old man had mastered during this time was bonjour, and it was this that made all of Thanet call him Bonjour Crisp for the rest of his life. I like to think that Sir Henry's refusal to communicate with his captors in their native language was due to his sheer stubbornness and resistance to change, strong autistic traits. Either way, it is a good story. True or not, this does reflect a culture of almost romantic interest in autism as either being the noble savage, the quirky outsider, or tortured genius. Simple truth is that we will never know how many, if any, of these historical figures were in fact autistic. However, it is likely that autism has been with us a very long time, and autistic contributions to science, engineering, art, music, literature and social justice have been essential catalysts for positive change. Thank you for listening. Please check out my other podcast, Wide for Autism presents Autism Conversations, a series of informal interviews with fellow autistics to spread autism acceptance and promote positive change. And why not check out my website, wideforautism.co.uk. Thank you.